I want to tell you about a book. It's a book set in the US in the 1930s, and it's about a family from Oklahoma whose lives have been uprooted by the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. When their farms and land are repossessed by the bank, the family decides to pick up and head west to find work. The book follows the family as they deal with the harsh reality of being migrant workers. The strain on relationships, the awful working conditions, and the physical and emotional trauma that come from how poorly they're treated by the owners and enforcers of the company farms, as well as the labor strikes when the workers rise up and demand to be treated like human beings. The author doesn't hold back on showing the reader just how hard and ugly life was for migrant workers, including a scene describing a stillborn child. Stillborn presumably because of the conditions that the mother had been forced to endure. On a literary level, the book is built on colorful descriptions, on the dark irony of comparing the beautiful, fertile land to the dirty, exhausted, overworked people, on the role of religion in the lives of folks who felt betrayed and forgotten by God, on being displaced and feeling like an outsider in your own country, and on the predatory, capitalistic practices that have become synonymous with the 1930s. There's even an extended metaphor of a small creature who's making the same hard trek as the migrants, forcing us to consider whether we are anything more than animals, blindly trying to make our way in a cruel and unforgiving world. Now, if you're familiar with American literature, then you probably recognize this as a description of the American classic, The Grapes of Wrath, written by John Steinbeck. But it isn't. It's a book you've probably never heard of, by an author you've probably never heard of, written before that more famous book by the more famous author, but not published until 70 years later. This book is Whose Names Are Unknown, written by Sanora Babb, and her story, both the literal book she wrote and the story of her life, is incredible. But you've never heard it, because of John Steinbeck. So, today I want to tell you a story that's 100 years in the making. A story that's amazing and surprising and funny and humbling and awe-inspiring and tragic. I want to tell you the story of Sanora Babb. Sanora Babb was born in 1907 in Oto Territory, land that's now Oklahoma. Her father was a gambler and their family was poor, so they moved around a lot during Sonora's childhood. After repeated crop failures while homesteading in the high plains country of Colorado and Kansas, the Babb family moved back to Oklahoma, and Sanora was able to attend school for the first time at age 11. She was a quick learner, and she ended up graduating as valedictorian of her class. After graduating, she went to junior college, taught for a year, and then left to work as a journalist in Kansas for a few years before she decided to move out to LA to try to make it in the big city in 1929. Because of the onset of the Great Depression, Sanora was homeless for much of the next decade and took on odd jobs here and there, including writing scripts for a local radio station and short stories and poems that were published in small literary journals. Even though she was homeless and living in poverty, she was active in local progressive and anti-fascist political groups who saw the rising tide of fascism that was happening in Germany. During this time, she also met James Wong Howe, who was a Chinese-American cinematographer and also almost a professional boxer for a time. They fell in love, but they couldn't get married because of California's laws against mixed-race couples, so they got married while they were in Europe for one of Howe's films. But the US government still didn't legally recognize their marriage until many years later in 1948. Anyway, after she returned from Europe, Sanora went back to Oklahoma to visit her family, and she saw firsthand just how destructive the Dust Bowl had been, and the toll it had taken on the people in her hometown. In this little town in Oklahoma, with its broken walks and dirt streets, I saw them standing in line for the meat and potatoes of relief. I saw the people I used to know who had lived smugly in their imaginary stratas, standing in line together. The essential differences in these people in the first place had been very slight, and now with the superficial gloss gone, and hunger a near and known thing to all of them, their stricken faces, one after another in the line, looked very much alike. They stood together forgetting their old ways, gathering into the tight knots of distress and painful wonder at this unending process of decay that levels their lives down into a single want and fear. After seeing this, all this hardship and pain that her people were going through, Sanora decided to take action. In the 1930s, there was a mass exodus of farmers from the drought and dust-stricken lands of the Midwest, and all these people, whole families, were migrating westward, mostly to California. California was happy at first to have this influx of laborers, but eventually there were more people than there was work, and there was a whole microcosm of the Great Depression happening in California. So the federal government stepped in and in 1937 created the FSA, the Farm Security Administration, to figure out what to do about the displaced workers. And in 1938, Sanora joined the FSA as an assistant to Tom Collins, who was a labor camp organizer. Sanora lived and worked in the labor camps. She helped families find work and medical supplies. She fought alongside the workers as they demanded better hours, better conditions, and better pay. She joined strikes and even spent a night in jail for a strike she helped organize against unpaid child labor on a walnut farm. And during all that time that she spent volunteering with the FSA, living among the shattered families who, like her, had escaped the Oklahoma droughts only to be met with disaster and ruin, Sanora Babb took notes. She was a journalist, after all. But these notes were more than just journalism to her. In fact, she eventually wanted to write a novel based on the notes she took. She didn't want to write for commercial acclaim, but instead to send a message. To humanize the Okies, the displaced workers, the hungry families, the proud, hard-working people that she knew and loved, so that someone, anyone, would help them. And so she did. While she was working full-time in the labor camps, she spent her off hours writing and eventually turned her notes into a novel manuscript. She sent a few chapters of the manuscript to Random House Publishing, and they loved it, and gave her an advance so she could focus on finishing the novel so they could publish it as soon as possible. But soon wasn't enough. Before she had a chance to take her finished manuscript to New York to have it published, another book was published. A book that enraptured the nation and, more importantly, the publishing industry. Let's quickly take a brief aside to talk about John Steinbeck. John Steinbeck is an American author who wrote several classics of American literature and film, including Of Mice and Men, East of Eden, and most notably, The Grapes of Wrath. A lot of folks consider The Grapes of Wrath to be the great American novel, and it's easy to see why. It's a beautifully written story about a simple American family struggling through the mess of American disasters that racked our nation during the 1930s. This novel opened people's eyes to the plight of the farmers and migrant workers who had been displaced by the drought and dust storms of the Dust Bowl. It was a hard, dirty, heart-wrenching time in history, and Steinbeck wanted to shine a light on all that grime and dust and death to inspire the country to help its most struggling citizens. To write the novel, Steinbeck traveled to the labor camps where migrant workers lived and worked, and he collected notes on what he saw and heard during his travels. He also worked closely with Tom Collins. Remember him? Tom Collins acted as a sort of guide for Steinbeck, leading him through the various camps, getting him in touch with workers who lived there, and Steinbeck returned the favor by helping out a little around the camps. Collins also helped Steinbeck by providing field notes that he had collected, either notes that he himself had written or those written by other FSA workers. These notes were instrumental in helping Steinbeck craft The Grapes of Wrath, since they gave him a more holistic insight into the real lives of the families who lived and worked in these camps. He simply would not have been able to write strong characters without these notes. The Grapes of Wrath, as we know it, would not exist without these notes. Where the trouble comes in is that some of the notes that Collins provided Steinbeck came from one specific FSA worker, one who took her notes while she was living and working full-time as an organizer in the FSA labor camps, who was from Oklahoma, just like the migrants, and who was working on her own novel about Dust Bowl refugees. That FSA worker, as I'm sure you have guessed, was Sanora Babb. Now, I'm not going to cast John Steinbeck as the villain of this story. There are lots of conflicting accounts of all of this, and all of the actors are dead, so the world will probably never know the truth. We think that Sanora knew Tom Collins had borrowed a copy of her notes to give to a visiting writer, who ended up being John Steinbeck, but we don't actually know how forthright Tom Collins had been with her. We don't know whether Steinbeck knew he was using notes that were written by anyone other than Tom Collins himself, and we definitely don't know whether he knew he was using notes from Sanora Babb specifically, even though the two had met and had dinner, along with perpetual third wheel Tom Collins, on a couple of occasions while they were both in the FSA camps. The Grapes of Wrath was dedicated to Steinbeck's wife and Tom Collins, indicating that Steinbeck either A, didn't use her notes, B, used her notes without knowing they were her notes, or C, used her notes knowing they were her notes and is just an asshole who doesn't give credit where it's due. But, again, there is just a lot that we don't know for sure about this whole situation. But what we do know is the result of the situation. We know that The Grapes of Wrath was written using FSA workers' notes, some of which were written by Sanora Babb, who had taken the notes to use for her own novel she was writing, and that The Grapes of Wrath was published just months before Babb's work was set to be published, in part because Steinbeck wrote so quickly since he was writing full-time, while Babb could only write in the evenings since she was working at the labor camps full-time. We know that when The Grapes of Wrath was published, it was a huge hit. It helped spread information about the struggles of the migrant workers, and it was a critical success, and it was even made into a film that is still regarded as being one of the greats. We also know that Random House Publishing tore up Sonora's book contract because they didn't think the literary world could support 2 books about the plight of the Dust Bowl migrants. And we know that Sanora quietly tucked her manuscript away and resigned herself to the reality that it was never going to be published. And this is where a lot of folks end her story. Sanora Babb was just a woman who had the bad luck of trying to write the same book at the same time as a more famous writer, and she lost the race and faded into oblivion. But that's not where our story ends. Because after Sanora Babb was rejected by publishers and hid her manuscript from the light of day, she got up, dusted herself off, and kept working. She joined a writers group that included some of the greatest names in literature, including Ralph Ellison, the Black writer best known for his novel Invisible Man, with whom she also had a multiple years-long on-and-off affair. These two poor but incredibly talented writers were, to quote a Ralph Ellison biographer, so nearly in love that they braved the terrors of Jim Crow to be together. She was also the editor of the literary magazine The Clipper, which is where some of Ray Bradbury's first short stories were published. In other words, Sanora Babb helped establish one of the most important and well-respected science fiction writers of the 20th century. She also continued to do humanitarian work, fighting for workers' rights and other progressive causes, and throughout the 1940s, she was active in several anti-Nazi efforts, including helping European artists immigrate to the United States. During the Red Scare of the 50s and 60s, Sanora and her husband were targeted by the House Un-American Activities Committee. She was blacklisted, but Hal was only gray-listed, so she moved by herself to Mexico to protect his film career from being damaged by their association. While in Mexico, she worked on her own writing. In the past couple of decades, she had consistently been publishing short stories and poems, but now she wanted to focus on the long-form work and set her sights on writing a novel. And, in 1958, her novel The Lost Traveler was published. She continued writing and ended up having a memoir, a collection of short stories, a collection of poems, and even a collection of her letters published. Sanora did eventually move back to LA with her husband, and they lived together until he passed away in 1976. She lived on her own for almost 3 more decades, until she, too, passed away. So, why haven't we heard of her? I mean, here's this woman. She's a nobody from Oklahoma who grew up literally dirt poor and wasn't educated until she was 11, but ended up being valedictorian. She traveled around the world on her own as a single woman in the 1930s. She was in multiple mixed-race relationships during a time when that was a really dangerous thing to do, for her, but especially for her partners. She hated Nazis, opposed fascism wherever it reared its head, and literally went to jail and was targeted by McCarthy for fighting for workers' rights. She lived and worked among migrant laborers who trusted her because she was like them, and who liked her because she was just, like, a really kind, compassionate human being. And her notes, potentially taken and used without her permission, were integral to the creation of the great American novel. And you've never heard of her. Why? Because she didn't get her novel published, because she wasn't the famous male author who was best friends with every publishing agent in New York, like John Steinbeck was. Because the work she did wasn't big and flashy. But then, in 2004, 65 years after it was written, 65 years of being stashed away in a drawer and hidden from the world, her manuscript, Whose Names Are Unknown, was published by the University of Oklahoma Press. She was 97 years old, and she died a year later. I found Whose Names Are Unknown because I'm doing research into the 1930s for a writing project that I'm working on. And because I'm a nerd, I always read the forewords in books, and in the foreword to this one, the writer, Lawrence R. Rogers, talks a little bit about the Babb-Steinbeck feud. At first, when I started to look into it, I was convinced that Steinbeck was definitely the villain, that he'd definitely stolen her work, and that this was going to be a #cancel John Steinbeck video. But it's not. It's a lot more complicated than that. We don't have any hard evidence either way. Like I said before, we don't know who knew what. If anything, it was probably just a miscommunication that's all Tom Collins' fault. There are some who cry plagiarism, and even my little story at the beginning of the video leans in that direction, but the truth is that while there are quite a few overlaps, Whose Names Are Unknown and The Grapes of Wrath have plenty of differences. Steinbeck's book is more literary, since it's filled with biblical allegory, but the way he frames his main characters, the Joad family, was widely criticized by actual migrant workers of the time, and even a lot of modern folks. Steinbeck portrayed his characters as ignorant, crass drunkards who ultimately mean well. Steinbeck himself even described them as more than people. They must be an over-essence of people, and wrote their dialogue in honestly really distracting dialect. Knowing the context in which he wrote the book, it's obvious to readers that Steinbeck only spent a couple of weeks actually talking to these people, and most of his characterization is based on notes written by Tom Collins, who found the migrants' speech funny and peculiar. Babb's book, on the other hand, is beautifully written, but it lacks the biblical allegory, instead opting to take a stronger stance on more concrete issues like workers' rights, since labor strikes are given a lot more attention in her book than in Steinbeck's. And Babb's characters aren't cliches. They aren't the uneducated, selfish, godless people of their contemporary propaganda, but they also weren't the simple-minded folk who were just there to be a vessel for the plot, like in The Grapes of Wrath. When reading her book, it's clear that she loved and cared for these people, her people, and you really feel like you're living among them, which makes sense since Babb did live among them in her childhood and during her time in the FSA camps. Anyway, this isn't a book review. I just want to make it clear that I'm not accusing John Steinbeck of plagiarism. But I do think that Sanora Babb's book is better. It's more concise, but still beautiful. It has more complex characters, and the plot and structure fall more within realism than within the realm of modernism that Steinbeck was writing in. And I like modernist works, don't get me wrong, but for the vast majority of readers, Whose Names Are Unknown is going to be the better book. So, there is the story of Sanora Babb. She was an incredible woman. Kind and smart and brave and helpful and fearless. Her life was filled with amazing things. She was kind of a badass. And yeah, the work she did wasn't always big and flashy, but the little work, the grassroots work, the human work, is sometimes the most important work of all. She is worth knowing about. And imagine how many people would know about her if she'd had her book published first, or if Steinbeck hadn't used her notes, or if... But we'll never know. We can't change what happened almost 100 years ago. But we can make things right. We can make Sanora Babb known as she should have been when she was alive. So, in lieu of making a biopic about her life, which would honestly be incredible, and if anyone in Hollywood wants help working on a screenplay for it, I will literally drop everything to go work on it. In lieu of that, go read her book. The thing took 70 years to come out, so it has quite a lot of lost time to make up. Let's make sure that the story of Sanora Babb is never hidden away again. Hi, Des. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. This one is a little niche, but it's a topic that is really important to me and that I care a lot about, as I'm sure that you can tell. Please like and share and subscribe and ring the bell and do, you know, all those YouTube things. If you want to follow me on Twitter, you can find me at Zoe_the_B. I also want to give a huge thank you to all my patrons whose names are scrolling over here. I always forget which side it is, over here beside me. And I want to give a special shout out to Zauber, Sigwa, A Tasty Snack, Comrade Fox, and Robert Bradford, as well as our 2 poem patrons for this video, Tyler Hall and Dylan. For you, Tyler Hall, you get a series of haiku. The till penetrates. We break her skin for our bread, and then pray for rain. We lost the big sky. The dust obscures everything but the pride of man. Lifeless but for grass, silent but for howling winds, the bison moves on. And then for Dylan, we have second star to the right and straight on till morning. I want to be immortal, like a dying star in the eyes of an astronomer. I want to grow fat and happy until I can't grow anymore and I burst. I want the light waves of my life to shoot out into the void and spread across galaxies, and everyone can see me shining there on the horizon for a brief, bright moment. But only if they know where to point their telescopes. So, if you enjoyed those, and would like to have a poem written for you and read in a future video, then you can come join us over on Patreon. The way that I'm doing poems now is a little bit different, where I will randomly choose one patron from the $5 and above tiers and write a poem for them, and that will be the poem that I read in the next video. Anyway, this end screen has been quite long enough, so until next time, stay safe, stay warm, except for all of my viewers on the West Coast and anybody else affected by this heat wave. You guys take care of yourselves, and I will see y'all again soon, I hope. Bye, folks. What did you think, Des?